Good evening. Please welcome Sherry Werb, Director of Center for Literacy, Learning, and Engagement.
Hello, I'm delighted to welcome you to Tracy K. Smith's closing event as our 22nd Poet Laureate Consultant in Poetry. Tracy was the first laureate appointed by our current Librarian of Congress, Carla Hayden. And in September of 2017, the librarian stood on this stage and welcomed her to the position. My introduction to Tracy came last fall, when I began as director of the library's new Center for Learning, Literacy, and Engagement. Just a few weeks into the job, I found myself traveling to the Black Hills of South Dakota to join one of our laureates' 7 American Conversation project trips around the country, along with Rob Casper, director of the Poetry Center, and Guy Lamolinara with our Center for the Book. We visited the Belle Fourche Community Center, the Matthews Opera House and Arts Center in Spearfish, and the Sturgis Public Library. In each place, Tracy read poems for her anthology, American Journal, 50 Poems for Our Time, and asked a simple question: what did you notice? Through that unassuming yet powerful question, and with humility, warmth, and an openness to whatever responses she received, Tracy helped audiences connect to one another through poetry. American Conversations, as well as The Slowdown, Tracy's additional laureate project of weekday podcasts and broadcasts, have proven that poetry can help us, whoever we are, in our day-to-day lives. By sharing in the safe space that Tracy, her poems, and laureate projects create, we are encouraged to reflect, discuss, and empathize, to deepen our connection to our community and even be part of a new community. This does more than prove the power of the art. It helps strengthen civic society. Tracy has shown me the transformative power of this work and has given me a sense of what the Library of Congress should aim for. Just as I am thankful she brought me to South Dakota, I am thankful she has chosen to share the stage tonight with Poets Laureate representing Hawaii, Indiana, Clark County, Nevada, Brooklyn, New York, and Oklahoma, all of whom have done their own amazing work. Tracy will begin the event with an address, then welcome her fellow Poets Laureate on stage. Joining them will be Jennifer Benka, President and Executive Director of the Academy of American Poets, who will lead a moderated discussion. I want to note that in just 9 days, for the first time, the Academy of American Poets will award over $1 million to 10 to 20 poets serving as laureates of states, cities, counties, U.S. territories, or tribal nations to recognize literary excellence and fuel civic projects. Please join me in congratulating Jennifer and the Academy. Before I turn the microphone over to Tracy, I want to take a moment to acknowledge our dear Poet Laureate as one of our country's national treasures. At many American Conversation events, Tracy began by reading from her most recent collection, Wade in the Water. The found poem sequence, I Will Tell You the Truth About This, I Will Tell You All About It, featuring letters from African American soldiers petitioning the government for their pensions, often elicited audible responses from the audience. Tracy culled the excerpts from 2 books, Families and Freedom, A Documentary History of African American Kinship in the Civil War Era, drawn from the Freedmen and Southern Society Project at the University of Maryland, and Voices of Emancipation, Understanding Slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction through the U.S. Pension Bureau Files. I can think of no better example of promoting civic literacy and giving voice to a past often ignored or forgotten while showcasing the importance of research and primary source documents. In I Will Tell You the Truth About This, I Will Tell You All About It, Tracy models how such documents can inspire each of us, how we too can engage with the library, reach in and explore its wealth of collections and find our connection to the past. In the title poem from Wade in the Water, Tracy connects the past to her own story. The poem begins, "One of the women greeted me. 'I love you,' she said. She didn't know me, but I believed her. And a terrible new ache rolled over my chest, like a room where the drapes have been swept back." There is so much to unpack in these opening lines that shows us poetry's power to situate us in the world as well as within our fears and desires, to capture the complexity of an overwhelming moment through simile, and to painfully and powerfully act with love and grace. When Tracy read this poem during her American Conversation events, she would also describe the process of writing it. The poem is dedicated to the Geechee Gullah ring shouters, and she returned to that greeting as a kind of rumination, while describing their performance and layering it in image after image with history. When she could no longer describe, Tracy's mind and imagination leapt, as only those of poets can, and she arrived at these last lines. "O woods, O dogs, O tree, O gun, O girl, run. O miraculous many gone, O Lord, O Lord, O Lord, is this the trouble you promised?" This is the kind of poem we need, a poem that gives shape to what we cannot otherwise say, in ways we can all feel. If we are to get past our differences and share our most profound, most painful, and beautiful moments of living, poems such as Wade in the Water show us a way. On behalf of the Library of Congress, I would like to say thank you, Tracy, for serving as the nation's Poet Laureate. And thank you for the opportunity you have given me, the library, and everyone you've met these last 2 years to connect with you through poetry. Please join me in welcoming Tracy K. Smith.
Thank you. Thank you, Sherry, for that wonderful and moving introduction. I'd like to begin these remarks with thanks for Dr. Carla Hayden, who changed my relationship both to poetry and to America. The profound honor of being named Poet Laureate has urged me to think deeply and ongoingly about why poetry matters, and to enter into life-changing encounters with other Americans from Alaska to Louisiana via poetry. I'd also like to thank the staff of the Poetry and Literature Center, Anya Cratney, Ann Holmes, and Rob Casper, for mobilizing so quickly and so magnificently to facilitate my Poet Laureate project, American Conversations Celebrating Poetry in Rural Communities. Can we clap for them? They're so great. I had an idea of what I'd hoped to do, but I had no idea how such a thing might happen. And they, together with Guy Lamolinara from the National Center for the Book, shepherded my wish into exhilarating reality. I feel indescribably lucky to have benefited from their vision, their know-how, their wisdom, and enthusiasm. And if you know Rob, you know what I mean by enthusiasm. I also owe a tremendous thanks to Jeff Schatz and Fiona McCrae at Grey Wolf Press. And I owe much more than thanks to my wonderful husband, Raphael Allison. who kept our home and our children both afloat and anchored during these 2 years of nonstop travel. Thank you. My hope for the American Conversations Project was twofold. On one hand, as a poet who typically reads in university communities and encounters audiences at literary festivals, I was eager to venture beyond campuses and urban centers in my engagement with poetry and poetry audiences. I wanted to travel to places that aren't typically targets for a great deal of literary programming. But on the other hand, I was also very determined to push back against the pervasive narrative of America as a divided nation. The narrative that says people in the rural heartland have nothing in common, not even a shared language with those of us in urban centers. I harbored the hope that if anything could defy this notion of an uncrossable national divide, it would surely be poetry, which jostles us out of a rote engagement with the world and opens us up with humility and curiosity to other perspectives on experience. I believed that poetry fosters a deepening relationship with reality, a more conscious and deliberate engagement with the lives of others and with the inner life that each of us houses. I believed that reading poetry builds in us a reserve of perspectives and strategies for living. I believed that reading poetry reminds us to think of life as dynamic rather than static, mysterious and rich rather than flat or pat, and that poems open our minds to the realness and the usefulness of others' experiences, that they instill in us a sense of participation in a long and ongoing history of human joy, struggle, and hope. That was my theory. And what I found in practice on each of our journeys was incredibly heartening. Together with my crew from the library, we'd land in a new place, gather our bearings in a local restaurant, gape in awe at the power and the particular beauty of the landscape on what might be a 2 or 3 hour drive, and then end up in a public library or community center or some other venue full of strangers miraculously willing to read poems with me and enter into candid, unguarded conversation. Conditioned by media exposure to expect a sense of difference or division, I felt and feel indescribably lucky to have found my way to a counter-narrative of thoughtful listening and mutual respect as fostered by poetry. Reading poems with others and talking in ordinary rather than critical or analytical language about what poems cause us to notice, remember, wonder, and feel has been a way of getting to know one another and accessing vital feelings in a space of safety. Poems have been these amazing tools for reminding us, no matter who we are, of the things we share. And that's not all. Poems also highlight the differences between us, advocating implicitly for the validity of differing perspectives. I'm aware of what we were able to impart on these trips. Some people discovered the ways that poems offer a means of capturing and examining the strange and remarkable features of our lives, like a 9-year-old girl in New Haven, Kentucky, who came by herself to a Saturday morning conversation at her local public library, which was her home away from home. She sat by herself in the front row, and I could see her taking everything in carefully. When finally she raised her hand, she asked, "When did you realize you had stories to tell?" I told her I was just about her age when I tried to write my first poem. "Do you feel like you have stories to tell?" I asked her. And she told us one that surprised and worried many of us. "You can grow up to be a writer if you want to," I told her. And after I got home, I sent a box of books to that small branch, thinking about what might make a difference to a kid like her. Others reclaimed a long-neglected love of poetry, After an event at Old Somerton High School in South Carolina, a group of women who were members of the first integrated graduating class described how they had written poetry back when they were students and how our conversation had inspired them to return to the practice. Others discovered a new sense of freedom in being able to talk about poems using the language they live in every day. A man in the audience at a class I was invited to give in Wyoming raised his hand midway through a conversation about a poem to say, "I get it. When you read a poem, you're just kind of pouring it through your own filter to see what gets caught there. My filter is different from your filter, and different things will get caught in your filter at different times, depending on who and where you are when you read the poem." Still others, like in a youth juvenile detention center near Juneau, Alaska, sought out poems on themes deeply relevant to their lives, but difficult to broach in everyday conversation. Themes like suicide, trauma, and addiction. But I also want to emphasize what the people in these communities gave to us is of equal importance to what they might have taken away. American Conversations was not about city folk going in to educate rural folk. It was about the ways that poetry changes everyone's view of the world and how it changes our view of ourselves. Returning to cities for readings and events over these last 2 years, I've become increasingly aware of the kinds of unwitting urban bias present in many of the questions that I heard. Well-meaning questions like, so what is the rural experience like? Or what is rural America's reaction to poetry? Or did you encounter any resistance or hostility on these trips? Questions which sought affirmation that the many different rural communities in this nation are alike, characterized by one easily summarizable trait and uniformly wary or suspicious of outsiders. In fact, I was shocked early into my first term to be asked point blank, were you surprised by the intelligence of people's responses in rural communities? If there is indeed a divide in this nation, perhaps it is perpetuated by unthinking assumptions like these. Assumptions rooted in the wish to summarize or characterize the unknown other as something single, unified, predictable, measurable. I like to believe these kinds of other defining questions didn't come up during the actual American Conversations tour because in every setting, participants were engaging in a new configuration of momentary community. I was there with staff members from DC. People from neighboring towns were present, sometimes creating an unexpected or unlikely cross-section of community. Sometimes audience members drove from hours away out of an existing love of poetry or because they thought it was important for their kids to see someone speaking in an official capacity who, as they often said, looked like them. One Kentucky mother said the exact opposite, that she wanted to expose her children to the viewpoint of someone who looked nothing like them. The concept of we was different from gathering to gathering, which means there wasn't enough of a certainty about who we together were for participants to seek certainty about who we weren't or how we were different from another specific group or demographic. I think that's important. I think placing ourselves in new configurations of community is something we ought to seek out more often because it helps to unsettle the feelings of confidence and authority that cause us to forget how much we can learn from others who are not like ourselves. I'll never forget the powerful uncertainty I felt at a home for veterans and pioneers about an hour outside of Anchorage, Alaska. Apart from one or two members of the audience, nobody volunteered to speak. I would read a poem and ask the question, what do you notice? And it would be followed by a longer than was comfortable period of silence. Sometimes as I was reading, an audience member would audibly moan. It was a reaction I wasn't used to, and it was difficult at times to sit with the long stretches of unfilled silence. But afterward, staff members were visibly excited it turned out that a sizable portion of the audience was made up of nonverbal members of the facility's Alzheimer's wing. Those moans and the inaudible movements that sometimes accompanied them were palpable indicators of the ways poems had spoken to or even woken up audience members. Without realizing it, I'd been in the presence of a remarkable response to the power of poetry, and it was an unforgettable recalibration of my own sense of what it means to engage with poetry. One thing that stays with me from that evening is the fact that it wasn't about me performing well or hitting it off with people in these different places. Rather, American Conversations was about giving people space to engage with poems in their own ways and in the terms most meaningful for them. If there's anything the experience of this project has made me want to change about how I engage with poetry in the other spaces I move through, spaces like cities and literary festivals and college campuses, it's this. I wish we could be more consistently willing to let go of our own need for certainty and for the desire to demonstrate our claims to authority. I wish we could turn down the volume on our egos and get past our own impulse to judge, rate, and assess. An impulse fueled, I suspect, by the many consumer-based interfaces we've gotten used to engaging with. Forums that assure us that our instantaneous, unfiltered, deeply biased, and often unfounded reactions are of enormous value. I wish that we could more often let go of the need to be seen as exceptional and authoritative in our reactions, the need to garner responses that demonstrate our exceptional and authoritative status, and simply submit to experiencing powerful and difficult to summarize feelings together with others. I wish that together in whatever versions of community we represent, we'd more often allow ourselves to wander a while through the wilderness of new feelings and the wilderness of old feelings in new forms, without needing to know and declare where we are and how we got there. In other words, I wish we could muster a willingness to get lost together, which is essentially the state poems offer their readers and the poets who write them. Poems invite us to move unpremeditatedly from a question or a state of upheaval through a series of spontaneous observations and responses, some of which are conscious, others unconscious, to something that feels like revelation. Poems draw us deliberately past our certainties and our assumptions and into something startling and consoling or chastening and enlarging. In order to most emphatically experience poems, we have to surrender authority, pay close attention, and let the poem itself lead us to a place where a new kind of sense prevails. I've long believed this was good for the individual mind and spirit. Now, more than ever, I believe it's good for the collective, the community, even something resembling the nation. During my travels, I've encountered many regional poets laureate working with energy and generosity to strengthen their communities with the things poetry offers. And so it's my great honor to gather tonight with them for a conversation about the ongoing work of Poets Laureate and the larger ongoing work of poetry. So I'd like to welcome the poets to the stage now. Hopefully we can pick this up and we'll get some other perspectives on what it has meant and what it means to be sharing and engaging with others via poetry. Starting from the right side of the stage, Vogue Robinson is Poet Laureate of Clark County, Nevada. She is a dynamic community builder, a galvanizing force in the Las Vegas literary community. When I visited, she was very clear to tell me, it's not the Strip, that's not Vegas. Vegas is people, Vegas is writers, Vegas is neighbors, Vegas is people who are building something together. So she's a booster for the city's and the county's cultural riches. She hosts workshops, writers' gatherings, and serves the community with poetry programs like the workshops she conducts for people who are living with Alzheimer's. And next to her is Tina Chang, who is Poet Laureate of Brooklyn, New York. Tina and I grew up together. We were classmates as graduate students back when we were just dreaming of maybe making a life together as poets. And so it's really so beautiful to be here together and to be able to celebrate the work that she's been doing in her capacity. One of the major emphases of her time, and she's been Poet Laureate of Brooklyn for 10 years, has been children. She's created a program to bring authors into public schools, and she's also led workshops with all age groups, from elementary school kids to adults, in retirement centers and memory facilities. Her laureateship is, well, it's been going on for 10 years, as I said, and throughout that time, she's found powerful ways to celebrate and promote poetry as a life-saving tool. Next to her is K. Aloha, who is Poet Laureate of Hawaii. I have mind envy. K. Aloha holds a degree in nuclear engineering from MIT. And one of the things that he's used his laureateship to do is expand the vocabulary and even the methodology that we associate with poetry. He has epic performance poems that, like the story of everything, right? That explore the universe from the Big Bang to the present, or native culture and different debates about what that means, or feminism. And he uses discourse from science, storytelling, and social justice to create these really dynamic pieces. And, next to K. Aloha is Janetta Calhoun-Mish, who is Poet Laureate of Oklahoma. Her work in this role celebrates Oklahoma history, literature, and culture, and has led her to communities and schools throughout the state. She spent a lot of time in rural communities as well, so I'll be excited to hear how our experiences match up with one another. She's also taken it as her mission to encourage Oklahomans to write their state's history and explore their own stories via poetry. And Adrian Matika is Poet Laureate of Indiana. In this role, he has tirelessly traveled back and forth across his state, hosting workshops and readings with visiting writers. And I have traveled a lot, but when I visited Indiana twice, and when I catch wind of what Adrian's doing, it's really tirelessly. Like, I'm deeply humbled by the generosity and dedication. He's also building an archive of poets with ties to the state of Indiana, which is far-reaching. And we visited a small library in Franklin, Indiana, and a school in Shelbyville, and there's a really beautiful sense of stewardship that he brings to the role. So welcome, Adrian. And we will be led in conversation by Jennifer Banka, who is President and Executive Director of the Academy of American Poets. And as you heard, she's a powerful advocate for poets, poetry, and poetry organizations nationwide.
Well, I want to start by first, Tracy, thanking you again on behalf of all of us for your brilliant brilliant work serving our nation as Poet Laureate. So
Thank you.
I know very clearly that you have touched the lives of so many people on your visits. I also want you to know that you have influenced the work of poetry organizations across the country. One of the things that I'm lucky enough to be able to do is work in partnership with 25 poetry organizations across the US who are collaborating and have formed an alliance called the Poetry Coalition. And because of you and the work that you've done, we have begun a conversation about how we are serving rural communities in our poetry programming, and that's not something that we've talked about before, so I want to thank you for that. You have been a model and been such a reminder in your work of how poetry can be a commons, and it can also be common ground. Your work reminds me of another poet who championed poetry's social possibilities, Muriel Rukeyser, who writes in her very influential collection of essays, The Life of Poetry, a number of relevant things, but one about how civilizations, in order to survive, draw on all sources of knowledge, any source of knowledge that they can find, history, inventions, science, and yet somehow throughout the ages, poetry sometimes has not been used as much as maybe it could have been. And yet she says that when communication seems to break down, it's then that we need to tap the roots of communication, and that's where poetry dwells. Because it's in poetry that one source is speaking to another source, and that's where and how personal and maybe communal transformation can be sparked. And perhaps that's why there are, in addition to the National Poet Laureate position, a growing number of states and cities who have created Poets Laureate positions. The first state that had a Poet Laureate was Colorado in 1919. And over the decades, a number of states have created that position. Now we have 45 states across the country that have Poets Laureate. And interestingly, now we have many, many cities that also do, and also US territories and tribal nations, and that's something that my organization has been following and watching and tracking. The first city, I believe, that had a local laureate position was Madison, Wisconsin, 1977, for the Badgers in the audience. There you go, Rob. That was for you, Mr. Casper. But most of the Poets Laureate positions that have launched on the city level have been since 2000 and 2001. Interesting, right? There's a part of me that wonders if there's a connection between what happened on 9/11 and the need that cities had to understand those tragic events and find important and meaningful ways to have conversations that can help heal and move forward. So I'd like to start there. The important civic role of the laureate. Why does it matter that states have Poets Laureate positions and that cities do? What is it in your role that you're able to do in terms of sparking dialogue? I'm looking at you, Adrian.
The great state of Indiana, the 19th state in the Union, has a very long history of Poets Laureate. We've had 72 years of Poets Laureate, but I'm only the second one who is not white. So one of, I think in the case, at least in my laureateship, one of the civic duties is to do some of the work that I think that woman from Kentucky was talking about, like getting a conversation going that is not from the same perspective of those who they've been speaking with. This has nothing to do with the really wonderful poets who've been doing this work before I got there. They all care deeply about the state of Indiana, but the state of Indiana is a very diverse state. It's a very problematic state in a lot of ways, racially and economically. And so it's, at least in my experience of this, has given me an opportunity to expand that conversation just a little bit, to show them that in fact, there are a lot of different stories that need to be told, not just the ones that have been going on for the last 72 years.
I was thinking about the question because you sent them to us earlier, and for me, poetry functions on the boundary between the private and the public. It functions that for me when I'm writing it because I'm engaging with other things, and I think it also functions that way for people when they hear it. And I'm not sure, some kinds of ritual used to do that, and we don't have a lot of ritual left in our communities anymore. And I think that two-way street between your internal self and your civic self that is activated in poetry is where the magic happens. And for me, I want to share that with everyone. Poetry saved my life in many ways. I want to take that. And also, I want to make sure that the rural areas, are more diverse in Oklahoma. The rural areas are more diverse than most of the cities. Native Americans, African Americans, Vietnamese, all kinds of people, much more than people think we're diverse. And I want to make a way for them to enter the civic conversation through the poetry that I help them write in workshop.
In my experience and in my brain, the way that I see all the different things we do with all of our outreach and the way that we approach our poetry, and it's really what it bubbles down to is making poetry accessible and every day for people. And not something that's intangible, but something that they can just interface with anytime they want. And it's there for them and it's present. And our job is to bring not only our work out and share that, but also to bring up other people throughout our communities and make their work visible as well. So I think when you combine those things, then now we start to have a dialogue between different folks from different communities and pockets, and that way we can further move along as a society.
I have so many thoughts based on what everyone is saying. Just to go back, and I'm the Poet Laureate of Brooklyn, and Brooklyn is already so rich in history and culture. Poetry is a pretty easy sell where I come from, because everybody who wants to be a poet or who has a very rich artistic life seems to kind of find themselves there. Oftentimes wonder why. Of course, it's physically beautiful, but also just to kind of go back to something that Adrian was saying about the history of Poets Laureate in Brooklyn. There were 3 Poets Laureate before me, and they were all male, so I was the first woman and also the first person of color. So with that comes great responsibility, I think. I often ask myself, because Rob Casper and a few others that were on that poetry committee, who I was really lucky enough that they reached out to me to apply for this position, I often ask myself, as I'm sure some of the other Poets Laureate have asked themselves too, is why me? And so when I think back on it, I think about the role of how important it is to be a person of color, and how I want to address not only diversity, and I think we could all speak to this, but also diversity is so different from integration. New York, specifically Brooklyn, is known as a very diverse place. Often that's the first word that comes to mind when people speak of Brooklyn. And I think in the various communities that I've just been honored to just be welcomed into, I think that one of the greater challenges that I feel is, how do we find, within the United States overall, true integration, and does that truly exist? And I think poetry is really one of those very rare spaces, and maybe it goes back to some of the things that Tracy was mentioning in many of her beautiful stories. It has so much to do with vulnerability. We are, each of us, so very vulnerable at the core. And I think that many of us walk around, trying to keep it together, trying to have, an armor, because the armor protects us and helps us to function. So I think in the civic work that we all do, it takes a great amount of time and effort to be able to break down those walls. And I find that poetry has the capacity to do that. And I think that a lot of it has to do with the silences that poetry just welcomes in. I think in the state where we are right now, within the United States, so much of it is about how much noise we can make and how much we can sort of show what it is that we know. But I think poetry kind of lays out the space of how much we don't know and how much beauty there is and how much we want to answer to all the curiosities in the world. And I think that civic engagement and that curiosity have so much to do with each other.
I think the role of Poet Laureate, I'm the second one to hold the position, and it's not state and it's not city, it's the entire county. So it's a very weird position to hold as far as what area are you in charge of, if you will. I think that it validates the idea of following your passion. When I go into classrooms and I go and speak with students, the idea of being a writer is a valid thing. Especially when teaching, if it's a workshop within the community or in a classroom, it's also about allowing people the space to express their feelings and let them know that their story is valid. And I think that Las Vegas, as a city, is also building its identity and so wants to tell its own stories. Lots of people come in, will write a story based on 1 or 2 years of living there, but you need the people who are born and raised in the county, in the city, in the area to really tell you how it's developed, how this casino went up and came down and got rebuilt. How this street is still under construction, but the changes now, whereas a lot of the legislation and the people that are in power have shifted, and there's a lot of women in power right now in Nevada, and it's cool. So I think the yearning to tell your own story, but then also the permission to tell your city story, your county story, your state story, and going forward with that. And I think that encouragement that writing is still valid, that people still read books.
So poets make excellent role models. All of you are excellent role models. And hopefully, as we're all appreciating more deeply, poetry has this incredible capacity to spark conversation that can help strengthen communities. Vogue, you're talking about the importance of storytelling, preserving stories. What's interesting about the role of Poets Laureate is it sort of puts a poetic twist on Shelley's notion that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world by acknowledging that fact, right?
By legislators.
Right. Were there civic themes that you were interested in addressing during your term, issues that you cared about in addition to diversity and representation? Can you talk a little bit about that and how you went about addressing those issues? Sure.
Yeah, I mean, one of the major things I've been concerned with is the ways in which poetry is undervalued as a teaching tool and as a historical document and as an opportunity for expression in the ways we've been talking about. So I came into it with the agenda that I wanted to try to get in front of as many young people as I could, in front of as many people who couldn't afford a workshop as I could, as many people who never thought that poetry was for them as I could, to allow them to sort of dictate what poetry could be. Of course, in the great state of Indiana, I don't know if I'm supposed to share this, but whatever. I had to sign it's a government position, and so I had to sign a document that said I wouldn't criticize the state government. And so I'm not, especially since the governor went to my high school. But there are some ways in which it's actually been, in all seriousness, very useful to me. The state organizations have been a great help in trying to get to some of the communities that I don't have the wherewithal to get to. So I don't know if that's exactly what you were asking, but that was what my plan was. Anyway.
I meant to say a while ago, Oklahoma was the 5th state to have a poet laureate. Violet McDougall was named Poet Laureate in 1923, so I need to recognize her. Many of you may have seen the huge coverage last year of the school teacher strikes in Oklahoma. And one of the things that came out of that is that their union sold them out. And there's still 25-year-old textbooks. I went to a school in Avon, Oklahoma, where you could look down the floorboards through the crumbling foundation and see the dirt beneath the school, and that's where they were trying to teach and work. And that was not unusual. Ceilings falling down, flooded classrooms. The teachers had a good reason, and they weren't just striking for pay. The teachers' list pay was on their last, even though we lost 30,000 teachers in the last 5 years because they can't make enough to eat on. What they wanted was textbooks, decent buildings, some money spent on the children. So I do a lot of work in schools, but when I'm at the schools, I also, if I can get time to have an in-service with the teachers, and even if there's not time for an in-service, I leave them handouts or lists of resources like Teachers and Writers Collaborative in order to do what little I can do to help support them in their great mission of educating a populace whose parents don't really want them to be educated, or maybe the state doesn't want them to be educated. I didn't have to sign it. And so that's what I try to do when I work in the schools, is actually leave more for the teachers to help to bring poetry in. So.
I'm gonna have to choose two, because through our poetry, we address all kinds of different issues, but the two that I think have bubbled up in the recent years have been particularly our science literacy and our ability to address climate change. So that's something that I've been really focused on in my work, is making, laying out the issue, defining it, and then laying out the solutions and how we move forward. So I think that has been a serious focal point. But in addition to that, I've also been focusing on returning to source, going back to the indigenous stories of Hawaii, and one in particular that I just want to highlight. There was this creation chant that was composed in the 1800s, it was the 1700s. And what it said was basically, at first was born darkness, and then was born sea slime, which is basically bacteria, and then was born the coral polyps, worms, and starfish, as well as the plants, and then was born crustaceans and insects, and then was born fish, you know where this is going, right? The fish, the sharks, the rays, and then was born the reptiles, and then was born mammals, and then finally humans. So it was basically evolution theory told in the 1700s through Native Hawaiian chant, oral traditions. Just a note of history, Darwin's Origin of Species was published in the 1800s. So we're talking about roughly 100 years before the Western world got a hold of it, right? But the cool thing is that when I go into these schools or into these auditoriums and I tell that story, we begin to realize that Native cultures have very significant stories to tell, and they were very much on point with science and mental, logical capacities, right? And so it's that celebration of all different kinds of stories that has been another focus, I guess, in my work.
So I became a mother for the first time right around the time I became a poet laureate. And so I think that those two roles really, they had to speak to each other. For example, the night that I was inducted as the Poet Laureate of Brooklyn, I was actually carrying my baby in a baby Bjorn. So when I looked at, I soon had another child, but when I looked at my children, I really wanted the role that I was fulfilling as the Poet Laureate to speak to not just them, but all children. Because when you're raising a child, you get to grow along with them. You get to see the joy of them forming and understanding words for the first time. What a joy that is. And so I started to think about what is it that I could do for children in many different communities. And one of the things which kind of goes back to something that which was already stated is that I thought about teachers and I thought about their jobs and how often and how much they give over their resources to try to provide books, to try to provide everything needed so that these children could fortify their language, fortify communication. So I developed a programs to be able to bring authors into schools. But not only that, I developed also diversity funds so that those teachers don't have to spend money out of their own pockets to be able to get students books that they felt that they needed that would diversify what they were reading. And those authors too, I also tried to diversify as well. There's one author named Kelly Starling Lyons who also is a founding member of the Brown Bookshelf, which really promotes the work of African American writers and African American stories. And she had this wonderful story which she shared with the children that when she was 8 years old, she read a book for the first time called Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. And she said it was the first time that she saw an African American child on the cover of a book, and it convinced her that she too could be an author. So I think just hearing those stories in many communities, I think helps to really promote this idea that these children can too live this kind of life, that it's not outside of their reach. So I think that in the work that I do, I'm also thinking about the children and providing books for them as well. And a lot of that has to do, as everyone knows here, has to do with fundraising. So much of the arts now, as it always did, I think suffers from not having enough funding. So a large part of the work that I do, and which I think actually that you have addressed at the Academy of American Poets, is really trying to find funding in all corners and talking to people. And I think that we haven't really gotten to that yet, but that is also a large part of our job, is not being only a speaker for and toward this community, but also how are we going to realistically envision a project and then put it into actual being and push it forth into the world.
To piggyback off of that, a lot of my internal missions were finish Bruce's work, which is the previous poet laureate of Clark County. I was like, finish what Bruce started. One of them was bringing the California Poets in the Schools program to Nevada. And it was, well, how are we gonna get the funding for this, where we're making it so that poets can live, can have a sustainable lifestyle in which they're going into classrooms, teaching poetry, being paid for their time and the lesson plans that they're creating, and also living their lives and writing books as well. And so it was the one thing that Bruce didn't quite fully finish, but all the proposals were there, and I was like, I'm gonna take it, I'm gonna figure out where I can submit it and get funding for this particular program. And I thought about the proverb of just lifting as I climbed, that I'm able to go different places as a result of the position. This title, either people know what it is or people can't pronounce the word. It's one or the other. And so the places where they know what it is, then more doors open for me. And so it was, okay, cool, you let me in. If you want me to speak at this, I think we should also bring this poet. Can we bring another poet in who's gonna do this? And yes, it'll be this much. And being unafraid to request funds and being unafraid to say, no, this person spent time prepping before, during, and after. We're having meetings and discussing how these lessons will play out. And I thought about my grandmother. And my grandmother at the time was living in California still, and we could not convince her to move. And I was like, well, I need to get my grandma fix, so I'm gonna take poetry into nursing homes. And I found a project that was founded by Gary Gleason, Glassner, G-L-A-S-N-E-R. So Gary already had a program set into place and that was funded by the NEA that brought poetry into nursing homes, into retirement homes, and they had all of the research there about nonverbal communication, about how sometimes people aren't able to speak but they're still able to listen, about how a person can hear a poem that they had to memorize when they were younger, and they won't remember the street they grew up on or their daughter's name, but if you read a poem that they used to know, it'll come back. And that moment, is a priceless moment. And my poetry staff, that's really, I don't know, like the building of community and creating this close-knit community of poets who we're all cheering for one another. I can name you 10 authors in the past 2 years who have published books in my community. That had the guts to go forward and said, okay, I'm gonna put a book out. But everyone was editing everyone else's book. Did you read Rodney's book? Did you read Jennifer's book? Did you see Angela's cover? What? Everyone was cheering for each other. And these poets came into my home and read poems to my grandma when my grandma moved into our home. And she made one of my friends read his poem again. She was like, it was too short, read it again. And it was after a really rough day, and she came back. She was back that day. So that integration of family, community, and working artists, creating something more for ourselves and connecting.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up with something that Vogue said. I think it was, first of all, excellent, so great what you were just saying. But I was thinking about this idea of creating access, right? Like the way that one of the opportunities that we're given is to open up some doors for those around us, right? I was talking about these various organizations who are kind enough to support me, and they don't know the performance community in Indianapolis necessarily, but they do now. Mm-hmm. They didn't know that there were these different little community groups who were doing writing at the library on Tuesdays, but they're starting to learn about them now. So maybe one of the things that we're able to do as we get wired in is to bring everybody rising tides, right? I'm so glad that you mentioned that.
I want to underscore something, Tina, you said, but first appreciate what we're hearing about poets in civic positions making a difference in the lives of teachers, making the difference in the lives of seniors who are in institutional settings, making a difference in the lives of people trying to understand environmental devastation. The work that laureates are doing, Poets Laureate are doing on the state and local level is largely unfunded. I'm just curious, how many of you have a stipend supporting the work that you're doing? And I'm guessing, Tracy not included, that it's around $5,000 to $10,000. No?
It's $250 a month.
$250 a month.
It's now $2,500. $2,500 is like your personal stipend, and then $7,500 is for programming.
Most of the positions across the U.S. Don't have an honorarium attached, as you've seen, and if they do, it's extremely modest. Nonetheless, again, as you're hearing, folks are traveling the state, they're doing outreach, they're buying books, they're supporting teachers. Just a public service announcement. These positions are run through the governor's office, the mayor's office, the State Humanities Council. I encourage you to reach out, find out who's running the Poets Laureate positions near you, where your family members might live. Get involved, support them. They need it. But now to some good news. I'm sure and I hope that you may have heard that poetry is booming. I think we have some friends from the National Endowment for the Arts in the house. There they are. I know in the work that I do that in the past 5 years, the interest in poetry has been growing year over year. We run a website, poets.org, and have a daily poetry series, Poem a Day, that Tracy is curating this month for us. Double-digit growth year after year, year after year, and yet we would still see these bleak headlines about poetry. No one cares, poetry's dead. And we're thinking, not from what we can see. Well, thanks to the National Endowment for the Arts, no one has to believe me. We actually have a study, an arts participation study that was released in the fall that demonstrated in the past 5 years, poetry readership in the United States has doubled. Doubled. And what's very exciting about this is that the largest growth is with young people, particularly young people of color. And I should note, the growth in readership is the same in urban and rural communities. And can I be fact-checked on that, Jessica? Yeah. So to Tracy's point, when people are asking questions, well, do people really read poetry? And people are reading poetry everywhere. I just wonder in your roles if you are feeling that swell of excitement and if you feel like your work has contributed to this over the past couple of years.
Yeah, well, it's funny about that question about if poetry is still working or still alive or whatever. They never ask poets that, right? Like, they're always like, is this sort of some thrown out to somebody else kind of thing, right? Well, I absolutely think that it's true. I know in Indiana, certainly, I would love to take credit for the work that was happening, but it's already happening when I get there. There are already people who are waiting to write poems. There are already people who are interested in reading poems. And I just have been creating spaces to help them do that. It's just, you know how quickly somebody will snatch the mic when they have something that they want to say. It's like the under 30 crowd or something. They found poetry and they've invested in it in this really beautiful way. So, like I said, I'll take all the credit I can get, but it was sitting there. It was in Franklin already. It was in Bloomington already. It was in Indianapolis already, just waiting for an outlet.
I have to say, the Oklahoma poetry community has been strong since about 1972. And that's not just in the urban areas, but there's always been writers groups. There's 5 or 6 monthly open mics with featured readers in Tulsa, Oklahoma City, Shawnee, Lawton, all around the state. And we all know each other. We're family. Tracy just attended our family reunion at the Scissortail Creative Writing Conference in Ada, Oklahoma. And so I had that to build from. But I have seen something different is I don't have to start by convincing people they don't have to be afraid of poetry anymore. That used to be the opening part of my thing. Well, I can't write poetry. They'd show up for some reason, they're curious. But, my whole thing was you don't have to be afraid of poetry. So I think it's being taught better, but I'm also going to give a huge amount of props to librarians. I think a lot of the comeback of poetry is from librarians. And I wouldn't even be a poet if I hadn't fallen in love with the library. But I see them, they're putting it out there instead of not just fiction books anymore. They put them out front. They put kids' poetry out front, they hand them out. So thank you, librarians, and all of you.
I absolutely feel the same energy. And it's for a number of, all these different programs out there, whether it's Poetry Out Loud, whether it's the slam poetry scene, whether it's poets in the schools, artists in the schools, and teachers taking it into their own hands when they know that they're not, there are standards that they have to adhere to. Did I miss any programs? Any? Okay. Teachers just take it into their own hands when poetry isn't really like a standard that's highlighted in what they have to teach. They go ahead and take the opportunity to, they really to take it upon themselves to teach this stuff. And when we get brought into those schools, it's like an extra special thing for the kids because they've been already immersed in it and we can take them even deeper. So I've noticed just that spirit of poetry is just, it has been very much alive and we're very much a part of it. And like you were saying though, it's we're just riding the wave, right? That energy is already there and that wave is already breaking, and where do you want to be on that wave? Do you want to, carve it up? Do you want to be in front? Do you want to be in the back? Do you want to be in the barrel? What pose are you making? And so for me, it's I do this poetry show every month. It's a poetry slam. And I rarely perform at it, maybe 3 times out of the year. And everybody always asks me, how come you don't really perform all that much at yours? I'm like, did you see the sign-up sheet? There's no space for me. I want I want other people to get the chance to be up on that mic because it's not, it's about them. It's about the voices of our community and highlighting that. And so that's how strong the scene is of poetry. And yeah, don't listen to those other folks who are saying poetry's dead, We're alive.
Yeah, I completely agree. I feel if anybody hasn't been to the Apollo Theater yet in Harlem, New York, you really have to go because I think the ways in which I grew up with poetry, I was, a typical sort of studious person, poring over my books, writing it in a notebook. And I think that when I started becoming very active in this role, I was invited to so many different spaces. So when I went to the Apollo Theater, I saw poetry lifted up in a way that I haven't seen before. Even sometimes in the most sort of established situations where established poets were appearing, I would see maybe 50, 60, and we would consider it packed. when I went to the Apollo Theater, there were hundreds of people and everybody was dancing. This is before the show started. Everybody was dancing in the aisles and everybody was in these choreographed dances, and I had never seen that before. And then since that time, I've seen more and more and more of it, working with organizations such as Urban Word NYC and the Community Word Project. There are so many organizations that, when I go back to your question, was, how much of it really has to do with the Poet Laureate and their role. So much of it, as everybody seems to be saying, it all kind of existed before I was there. I'm just really witnessing all of it, and I'm absorbing it and hoping to take that kind of energy and bringing it somewhere else or sharing their story. But I go back to this, I don't know why this story has stuck with me. I went to visit China a while back on a literary trip, and to visit different communities in China, and we were talking about the memorization and reciting poems. And one person said, "Oh, every Chinese person really has a poem like in their head." And I wouldn't say that was. They said I wouldn't say that was the case wherever I traveled, but she felt that in China that it was the case. And I said, "Well, why do you think that is the case?" They said, "Because in any place where we experience hardship, really one of the only things that we really have to keep us going is the written word, is the word. That's the thing, even beyond money, beyond resources, we still have that one thing." And so I think about that now in terms of the question of why is there this surge? I think we're, especially in the past few years, we are experiencing a particularly challenging time in our history. And I witness and I work with so many young people who feel no shame, who no holds barred, just want to express themselves now. They feel that it's the time, and they feel really emboldened to be able to push back and be able to open up about what they're feeling right now. And I think it has everything to do with the moment that we're living in now.
There's also the magic of social media. So, right now, if you walk into a Barnes & Noble, Rupi Kaur is on the end cap. On the end cap. You can't walk past her. You gotta stop and look at her books. And Nayyirah Waheed. So I had students who were like, "Do you know who Rupi Kaur is?" And I was like, "What are you talking about?" And this was a couple years ago. And so my students put me on to these writers who had major followings, who were extremely secretive. I still haven't seen a picture of Nayyirah Waheed. I want to know what she looks like. I want her to have a Wikipedia page that has more information on it. But she exists. And so these little small bites, these micro poems are saying what people need for the quick moment. And the fact that these baby computers that we walk around with all day in our pockets, we just, you're scrolling through it, but at a certain moment you catch a line that speaks to you. And I think actually it's technically making people do close reading, because if you only have this line, that's the only line you can look at, and you're like, yeah, this is deep. Okay, why is this? I'm gonna send this to you show it to your friend, but it's one line. The poem is probably longer, but you got that one line. And so I think about that, and that the world of publishing has changed. And so self-publishing is becoming a more respected thing. The audio book, even, I have friends who are recording books right now. He's like, "Do you want to read one of my poems?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'll read one of your poems for your audio book." Cool. But that we can do it with our phones, or you can buy materials. Poetry has already been a really accessible art form, pen and paper. It's not the same way as painting or other things. I scribbled my poem that I'm going to read tonight on my paper because my phone was dying, because that's poetry. And it's always there, and it's in the dialect and the conversations we have and the metaphors that people use every day, your grandma's language, your great-grandma's language, and Oklahoma, even the simple phrases of long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chair, these are all images that live. And so I think, yeah, publishing has changed, accessibility, the magic of social media, and poems are everywhere. Everywhere.
Before we close out, we'd love for each of you to share a poem, if you would. Whatever you feel like.
All right, So I'm not going to share one of my poems. I want to share a poem by an Indiana poet named Etheridge Knight, who I think is really important, you know? And if you don't know Mr. Knight, I brought his book, one of his books, so you could get a prop. It's called Haiku, and there are 9 of them, but I'm not going to read the numbers. Haiku. Eastern Guard Tower glints in sunset. Convicts rest like lizards on rocks. The piano man is stingy at 3 a.m. His songs drop like plum. Morning sun slants cell. Drunk staggers like crippled flies on jailhouse floor. To write a blues song is to regiment riots and pluck gems from graves. A bare pecan tree slips a pencil shadow down a moonlit snow slope. The falling snowflakes cannot blunt the hard aches nor match the steel stillness. Under moon shadows, a tall boy flashes knife and sliced star bright ice. In the August grass, struck by the last rays of sun, the cracked teacup screams. Making jazz swing in 17 syllables ain't no square poet's job. Thank you.
Well, I was actually asked to write a civic poem upon my appointment as Poet Laureate, and that's what I brought to read. You may need to know only one thing. There's a word in here, Wewoka. It's from the Muskogee Creek language, and it's the name of my hometown. It means barking water. There were rapids. Directive. You birthed me, land of arrow and hoe. Your red rock fossilized deep in my bones. Near a rural mailbox, a young war widow recalls sweetheart's kiss under mistletoe. A tire swing spins in a shadowed grove, searching horizon for a child long gone. Down a trail on the prairie worn by buffalo, glimpse of a gray fox at the bottom of a slope. Hunter sets his sights on a white-tailed doe. Venison's better than poverty's half-loaf. Scissortail sings on a branch of black willow. Coyote yips in the hills a comical rogue. Alone in sere pasture under sky's blue bowl, crow call a code that catches in my throat. Under a flat yellow stone up a dusty red road, plant my ashes near Wewoka on a dusty plateau.
So this was inspired by the movement towards planting food in our gardens, yeah, and also the sustainability movement. We've been growing a garden around our place. We don't have much space, but we've been working the soil beneath our feet, watching the green sprout over the concrete, watching the vines rewrite the graffiti on the walls. And we know this garden is a simple symbol that there is so much more to be done in this world, and sometimes it gets overwhelming, but we take responsibility for what we can control. And so we're starting by planting seeds and caretaking, making the ecosystem thrive, watching the earth come alive, reflecting on the way we're living our daily lives. See, we've been growing a garden over time, so when we step outside, we can visualize what green energy looks like, to remind ourselves that we're no different from the trees. That all the energy we need can come from the sun, the wind, the sea, and the infinite worth of geothermal heat. And we know that another world is possible, that no matter how hopeless any one of us feels, this movement is real, that our convictions lead to legislation, lead to conservation, that technology must serve ecology. And so this garden is how we redefine the boundary lines between us and the global community. We've come to learn that there is no separation, that every nation on this blue planet is symbiotically fused, and everything we do affects some part of you, so we've been inspired to limit our impact, leave our surroundings better off than when we arrived. We have vowed to reverse the destructive tide before we die. See, We've been growing a garden for our children, leaving a better world for them to live in, teaching them to caretake what they've been given, show them to take a stand for sustainability, how to find the balance between progress and preservation, guide the way to a self-reliant revolution. See, this garden is for our children. This garden is our pledge to them. Cool. Thanks.
So this poem is also by another poet named Eileen Miles, and I just wanted to thank Jen ahead of time for the work that she does. And I found this poem actually on the Academy of American Poets site, and ever since I found it, it's been on my desktop, and I read it every day. Notebook, 1981. I was so willing to pull a page out of my notebook, a day, several bright days, and live in them as if I was only alive, thirsty, timeless, young enough to do this one more time, to dare to have nothing so much to lose, and to feel the potential dying of the self in the light as the only thing I thought that was spiritual, possible. And because I had no other way to call that mind, I called it poetry. But it was flesh and time and bread and friends, frightened and free enough to want to have another day that way, tear another page. Thank you.
Do your evaluations. It's how you get funding. This poem is called When the Poem is Done. When the poem is done, never. When you say so. When a stranger calls it kin. When its inspiration lives behind its eyelids, under its tongue. When the poem is lifted by a self-made breeze, becomes aspiration in a room of your peers. When it illuminates you mid-line. When the poem is rooted in itself, fruit-bearing, apple blossom filling the wind, beckoning hello, and its leaves all live as midday boons.
So, thinking about the notion of how we might choose to get lost together and listening to us, I realize maybe I'll rephrase that. We are lost. We are lost, and I think poetry is a way of acknowledging that and working together. So this is a poem, I think, that comes out of that realization, an old story. We were made to understand it would be terrible. Every small want, every niggling urge, every hate, swollen to a kind of epic wind. Livid, the land, and ravaged like a rageful dream. The worst in us having taken over and broken the rest utterly down. A long age passed, when at last we knew how little would survive us, how little we had mended or built that was not now lost. Something large and old awoke. And then our singing brought on a different manner of weather. Then animals, long believed gone, crept down from trees. We took new stock of one another. We wept to be reminded of such color. Thank you. Can you guys stand up?
Sorry.
Well, thank you to all of our Poets Laureate, and of course to Tracy, and thank you to Jim Benka. I'm Rob Casper, the head of the Poetry and Literature Center, and special thanks to Vogue for doing my job for me. You should fill out those forms, those surveys. They will help us out. You can leave them on your chairs. You can leave them on the tables in the back. Speaking of the back, as you walk out to your left, you can go to the Whitall Pavilion. Our Poets Laureate will be signing books. So get some books, have them sign them, tell them how much you love them and love tonight. We hope to see you back here in September when we have a 23rd Poet Laureate Consultant in Poetry. If you want to find out about that event and all the events that we do to celebrate poetry and literature year-round at the library, around Washington, D.C., and around the country, visit our website, www.loc.gov/poetry. Thank you and good night.